address the conference.
Let me take this opportunity of welcoming my very distinguished panelists, Mr. Suleiman H. Adamu, the Minister of Water Resources of Nigeria. He's a very, very distinguished person. He was the winner of the Nigerian Port Authority Prize for the best final year student in civil engineering. He's bagged a master in project management from University of Reading in UK. Many, many distinguished awards. He's a fellow of the Nigerian Society of Engineers, member of the American Society of Engineers. So great pleasure having you with us, Minister, here with us. Also delighted to have with us Mr. Richard Damania, who's the lead economist. He's a water global practice head of the World Bank. He leads the practice work on analytical advisory and the operational engagements. Before joining the World Bank, he was a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and he's published extensively over 100 papers that span matters ranging from natural resources, infrastructure, economics, climate change, and he recently done a wonderful study on India. The diagnostic study on India was a remarkable study, I must say, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a great pleasure having all of you. I'll just quickly give you an overview, this presentation on the Swachh Bharat mission. Ladies and gentlemen, this particular program is one of the many programs being driven by the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. He's driven Make in India, Startup India, housing program, many programs. But this particular program of Swachh Bharat has had the maximum attraction and has been the most successfully well-executed program on ground. And this has largely been because there's been immense political will behind it. There's been public funding. There's been unique partnership. And there's been a huge amount of people's participation behind this. So political will, public funding, partnership, people's participation. This program has also demonstrated that it's possible for India to bring in public programs of this nature, to bring in scale, speed. It's also had this huge appeal in terms of stigma, which has been attacked. And people have taken this head on as a mass movement, and it's also shown the ability to sustain a program of this nature. So 4 S's: scale, speed, stigma, and sustainability. This particular program has also, the challenge, why has Swachh Bharat mission achieved better results than preceding programs, and why has it achieved better results than many other programs of this government? It's led to large-scale investments. It's been demonstrated by the government that the government will put in resources. So it has led to leveraging of public financing. It's also brought in the microfinancing. It's also brought in corporate funding into this, and I'll deal with some of this. First of all, on sanitation, it has a very huge multi-dimensional impact on India. It has huge impact on nutrition. It has 1 in 2 women in India are anemic, 1 in 3 children are stunted, 1 in 4 children are wasted, and nearly 40% of India's children are physically and cognitively stunted, mainly due to lack of safe sanitation. And this at a point of time when we are passing through a window of demographic transition, which rarely happens in history. So it's very important, to my mind, attacking nutrition up front is very critical, and therefore the criticality of sanitation. There's a huge sanitation, lack of sanitation costs India more than 6% of our GDP. That's what the World Bank says, and many of us don't realize this, that it has huge cost in terms of economy. And it has massive implication in terms of productivity. Almost close to 73 million working days are lost each year due to sanitation and waterborne disease. And improved sanitation under the Swachh Bharat mission has actually saved close to about 3 lakh children below the age of 5, according to the World Health Organization. And I think more than anything else, it's brought in women's dignity. Having access to toilets has led to a 1.5% increase in female labor participation. And this is critical because gender parity for India is important. India has only 22% of its women working. If we are able to bring it to the world's average of about 44%, we'll be adding 700 billion to our economy. And therefore, gender parity is critical. And for gender parity, women's dignity is absolutely critical. And education, I would like to say that improved sanitation leads to better learning outcomes, higher attendance, and lower dropout amongst girls. The huge amount of dropout that we are having in schools with toilets, with this movement, I think it's shown a huge improvement. So this has been people's, one second. Just a minute. So I'll just move on. So if you look at the overall rural households toilet coverage in percentage terms, it's grown enormously. It's shown a massive push forward. You'll see the graph growing in terms of toilet coverage. It's been a huge movement if you look at the census 2011, and if you look at September 2018, the overall rural household toilets coverage has grown enormously to about 94.55%. So if you look at open defecation-free status in urban India, for instance, and if you look at this beyond these lines, if you look at it, 51.49 lakh households toilet against the mission target of 66.42. 68,846 wards out of a total of 84,358 wards are having 100% door-to-door collection of municipal solid waste. I was in Indore yesterday, and it was amazing to see how one of the dirtiest cities in India today has become the #1 cleanest city in India simply because of door-to-door collection and segregation at household level. 3,612 cities have declared themselves ODF, and 3,000 cities among them have been certified as ODF through an independent third party. That is, third party verification is going on. And why this is critical is simply because of the size and scale of India. India is bigger than 24 countries of Europe, plus another 30,000 kilometers. And therefore, to do a movement of this kind across India with huge amount of people's participation, involving municipalities, involving rural areas, involving panchayats, has been a massive movement, and the entire value chain has been attacked in this movement. So if you look at the urban program, if you look at the overall status in Swachh Bharat Mission Urban, you'll again see household toilets in terms of lakhs, which has grown, community and public toilets, which has expanded, and 100% door-to-door collection of solid waste in wards has grown and expanded. We are very close to achieving the mission target. The achievements have been so enormous. I mean, nowhere in the world would a program of this nature we would have been able to attack it without the huge amount of political will, which is translated from Government of India to the field level, and local political leaders have got involved in this movement. So what has been the activities under sanitation coverage? That is segregation of waste at household level, which in many ways has also led to reduction of waste at household level. There's adequate infrastructure for collection, then transporting and processing of segregated waste, on-site treatment of waste by bulk generators, and huge number of dustbin and proper disposal of the effluents. All have been addressed. Now, this has led to massive benefits of poor sanitation, improved health, economic benefits to the country, generation of better quality human resources, a greater level of community cohesion, which is very important, and benefits to women and children, and better opportunities. Now, there is a challenge of financing, and it's important to touch upon this because large-scale investment in sanitation is required. There has been a huge amount of public funding for rural sanitation. Close to the government itself has put in close to 20 billion. There's been public funding for urban sanitation where we put in close to 10 billion. And there have been other government funds, including Manrega, and all ministries have earmarked funding. So we've had central assistance, we have state contribution, we have had beneficiary contribution, that is people contributing, and there's been an immense amount of public private partnership, that is through corporate funding. We've had Swachh Bharat Kosh, which has received over 100 million, and we have corporate investment in sanitation close to about 5 billion. And also, we've had self-financing. So funds from corporate social responsibility have flown into this. And we've had some unique funding from debt support, bonds and public issue, and Mr. Damania will talk about some of these issues in a much bigger way later. Now, what is the way forward? The latest survey has revealed that more than 90% of the households who have access to toilets are using the toilets, and this is a marked increase from the earlier studies. And the main reason for this is not about making toilets, but about bringing in a behavioral change. The minds and attitudes, changing the minds and attitudes of young people, and changing the minds and attitudes of Indians at large. And this has been largely driven in terms of a huge educational movement. It's about extension, it's about mass communication, it's about information. And I think the challenge is of moving towards sustainability of the UDF status and the UDF plus activities by bringing in better technologies for solid and liquid waste management. And the Prime Minister has personally led the mission. He's personally been involved. The sanitation has become a huge public movement in India. I've been in government for about 40 years now, and I've never seen a public movement of this nature, particularly for cleanliness, for toilets, and for bringing in cleanliness in rural areas and urban areas. And this, it's very important that we maintain this momentum and accelerate this momentum. And therefore, the cities and villages are being ranked. We are naming and shaming them. Those who are not maintaining themselves, we are putting this in public domain so that tomorrow good governance and sanitation becomes equivalent to good politics. And people who don't keep their cities clean are voted out. And therefore, those who keep their cities clean are voted in. And therefore, sanitation must become votes. And therefore, cities and villages are trying to improve their ranking in cleanliness. We put all this in public domain. And we are extremely hopeful that India will achieve the SDG goal of achieving the universal sanitation for all well before the time frame of 2030. With these few words, I'll conclude, and I would request the Honorable Minister, Mr. Suleiman H. Adamu, Minister for Water Resources of Nigeria. Extremely grateful to have you with us, sir. We look forward to your speaking a few words. Thank you very much.
Mr. Moderator, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here to give you a slight insight into our experiences in Nigeria as we move towards attaining the target of making our country open defecation free, as well as towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in general. I have a brief copy of slides, basically showing the situation of Nigeria at a glance, where we are in terms of sanitation, the case for mobilizing finances and creating markets for promoting sanitation investments, our approach, our achievements, and the way forward. At a glance, see that we are not a small country. We have an estimated population of about 190 million people, We have a federal structure with the federal government, 36 states, and the Federal Capital Territory making 37, as well as 774 local government units. Basic sanitation coverage, as you can see, in urban areas 49%, in the rural areas only 35%, with a national average of 42%. The reason being that when we're implementing the Millennium Development Goals, I think we paid too much attention to the water supply aspect and basically neglected sanitation. Where we are today and where we need to get into financing and marketing, you can see the statistics again, very dismal. Open defecation, 47 million people still practice it. And basically over 100 million people not getting the required sanitation in terms of the definition provided under SDGs. So we have 44 million enjoying basic sanitation and only about 36 million people that have safely managed sanitation. This is based on the definition by, under the Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore we see that there is a huge opportunity, there's a potential there for financing sanitation infrastructure by the public and the private sector. So, national targets versus current progress. To achieve the 2030 target of universal basic sanitation, we need to add 3 million latrines every year between now and 2030. And our current delivery of improved latrines is only about 160,000 per year, or 5% of the requirement. And therefore, we need to make that quantum leap. We hope to do that soon, but we need it in order to move forward, because at the rate we are going is a very slow progress and there's no way we can meet the target set. Now, the issue is we cannot continue, or we cannot support this effort from budgetary allocations alone. We need to find some other means of funding. Clearly, that was the reason why we failed the MDGs, because we were relying solely on budgetary allocation from the federal government and the states, as well as the local government, but that cannot work. So we have to find some other means. And luckily, to a large extent, 61% of Nigeria's population has access to some kind of financial service through banks and microfinance institutions. But until recently, none of them would offer any loan related to sanitation at all. It's mainly about commercial activities and so on. Our banks have not really been supporting social infrastructure and other development efforts. Now, luckily, we have 3 such companies that have started. And our approach to mobilizing funding outside the budgetary provision, of course, is to engage the financial institutions in loan products for sanitation businesses and households. That's at a more general level. But we're lucky we also have an age-long tradition of community cooperation and, credit scheme, what we call Adashi. And that has been being used for other things, for people preparing for marriage and so on. And it's quite a creative thing that we found an opportunity to leverage that to support sanitation efforts. So at the national and state level, we are trying to facilitate creation of a revolving fund, and then to also kind of get lending support from the microfinance institutions and banks. We're also partnering with rural financial institutions to offer sanitation loan products to households. But at community level, we have the formation of wash savings and credit groups. Will be taking loans to improve toilet construction through these adashes. Well, so far, we have done quite a bit in terms of forming formation of community savings and credit groups, the adashes, where it's a continuous process, but we've started. And we've formed about 1,800 community savings groups, leading to 8,500 improved toilets constructed. And the next step is to add another 2,500 saving groups in 2019, and as much as 70,000 between 2020 and 2025. We also do the partnership with rural financial institutions. We've signed MOUs with 45 MFIs to initiate sanitation loans, and 5 have started issuing loans to households valued at about 40 million naira. And the next step is to partner with the Central Bank of Nigeria and state governments on revolving funds to provide cheaper financing for the MFIs, that's the microfinance institutions, and subsequently to households and toilet business owners. The third thing we have been able to do is creation of national and state sanitation revolving funds. 3 states have initiated this process to provide a window of cheaper financing for the MFIs for onward lending to households and toilet business owners. Going forward, we need to advocate with development partners and big businesses to initiate sanitation revolving fund schemes. And we're also going to do some advocacy with tax authorities so that we can get some tax incentives for that purpose. And of course, we have to implement an ODF campaign by 2025. That's our target. The plan was launched, will be launched in the mid-November. It follows our roadmap, which was initiated about 2 years ago to end open defecation by 2025. The campaign has 3 directions. We have the mass media campaign. We need to strengthen community behavior change. We're working on that also. And there is a need to establish a kind of a structure, basically a secretariat, of which we've already, federal government is committing a fund of about 30 billion naira, which translates to about $100 million, to incentivize states to mobilize and provide their own matching resources towards the implementing of the ODF, because our biggest challenge is getting the states involved. As a federal government, we create all the policies, we provide all the plans, but we get a lot of trouble. We get into a lot of trouble because at subnational level, we tend to get a lot of challenges. We have some states that have different governments. We have governors that have different priorities, and therefore, sometimes we don't get the results that we need to, and also because the states also have different economic capacities. There are different economies on their own. You find out that they cannot go at the same pace. So we have to find ways in such a way that we can move everybody at the same time. And government is providing the 30 billion naira fund to be spread over the next few years up to 2025, so that we can provide some incentive to those states to do more. Hopefully, by the time I get back, we'll have a date for the President of Nigeria to launch our WASH action plan, which includes this ODF roadmap, and under which the declaration will be made for the 30 billion naira fund. And I'm happy to say that we've also had useful discussions with the Swachh Bharat mission here in India, and we'll be sending a mission shortly, a team of our technical people to come and begin some form of collaboration so that we can improve on our processes and also learn from the experiences of India on how we can make that quantum leap, or the Concord leap as they call it here, so that we could achieve our targets by 2025. Like I said, the process, we are moving. We've been able to get at least 5 or 6 local governments out of the 774 totally open defecation free. We have thousands of communities, over 18,000 communities that are open defecation free. But Nigeria is a large country, and I think that's just a drop in the ocean. We need to make some progress, and funding being critical, we have to find a way to deal with it. And these are some of the ways we think we can go about it. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that very exciting presentation. We'll open it up later to the floor for question answers. May I now request Mr. Damania, who's the global lead economist in the World Bank, to make his presentation on financing sanitation.
Honourable Ministers, distinguished delegates, of course it's always a pleasure to be here, especially in India, and it's a privilege to be giving this talk. So my task today is really to talk to you about the global challenges of financing sanitation and the opportunities that we have. But before we go there, I thought it might be interesting for us to first go back into time, into history. This image that you see is an artist's rendition in 1850 of the River Thames in England. In 1850, the River Thames was a fetid sewer. It used to be called the Great Stink. And this was also a period in which England was witnessing the fastest economic growth rates that it ever had done before that. So despite the fast economic growth rate, infant mortality, the death of children, kept rising. And this kept happening until people realized the importance of clean water and safe sanitation. And the death rate, the infant mortality rate, kept rising until policies were put in place to provide clean water and clean sanitation. Let's now fast forward 150 years. What's the situation like today? Many of you will have seen the graph that's there on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a very familiar graph to people in the sanitation field. I use very old data here, 5-year-old data, because you have a greater distribution of data points and countries. Each bubble is a country, and the size of each bubble is simply the population of a country. If you go on the vertical axis, up and down, that's the mortality rate or the death rate of children. And if you go on the horizontal axis, that is simply access to sanitation. Remember, this is 5-year-old data. But what you see in terms of the trend is very, very clear. We give greater access to sanitation, and the death rate of children comes down. It's almost a causal correlation that you see over there. And we understand the reasons for this very, very well today. We know that poor sanitation causes a host of problems, such as diarrhea, and we know that these problems are especially bad if they affect children in the first 1,000 days of their life. A child that encounters bouts of diarrhea in the first 1,000 days does not grow to her full mental potential or her full physical potential. As a result, she or he ends up being mentally stunted, physically stunted, and is less productive as a member of society. And indeed, globally, what they find is being 1 centimeter shorter than your average cohort causes a wage penalty of about 4 to 5% per annum. In other words, you earn less and you produce less. For this and all the other reasons that we understand, the World Health Organization tells us that for every dollar invested in sanitation, we get $5 back as a return. And this is perhaps amongst the highest returns that you could get for any development intervention. So if you don't have a willing finance minister, these are the sorts of numbers that you can give to your finance minister to put money towards sanitation. It perhaps gives you the highest payback of anything else you can do when you compare it to roads or anything else you might wish to actually do. Well, what is the nature of the challenge today? How big is the challenge that we have today? It turns out that globally, about 76% of urban wastewater is not treated effectively. And we know urban centers are places where you have a concentration of waste and a concentration of people, so the health risks in urban centers are really, really high, obviously much higher than they are in other parts of a country. And we know that globally about 800 million people still defecate in the open. If we try to address these problems and try to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the experts tell us we will need to spend 6 times more than we do today. That little blob that you see is the amount of spending that we do today, and that large column that you see is the amount of spending we would have to do to achieve SDG 6.2. So where is this money going to come from? Globally, we have a problem facing us. Traditionally and quite rightly, most of the money that came to sanitation came from the public sector. But if we compare the private sector and the public sector today, we observe that the private sector has a lavish surplus of about $100 trillion, looking for a safe return on its investment. And conversely, almost as a reflection, the public sector is in debt to the tune of $63 trillion. That number is almost too large to comprehend. And if we look at the policy trend lines, it seems highly unlikely that that is going to change in the near future. And one reason, there's many reasons for it, but one reason why that's not likely to change is what we're observing today is in good times, countries are increasing their debt by reducing taxes or increasing spending. So when the recession comes, and we know that the recession always comes, there's no fuel in the tank. So you have to borrow yet again to put fuel in the tank to get your economy going. So the future is one of growing public debt as far as we can tell at the moment. And our difficulty and our challenge is even worse when it comes to sanitation. And the reason why the challenge is particularly bad for sanitation compared to any other sector in the economy is at heart and at base, sanitation is a public good. Let's take a very simple example of that. Suppose we're talking about rural sanitation. Suppose I buy a toilet, but no one else in my village buys a toilet. Then we know that a fly can come from the outside with fecal matter and, of course, infect people in my home. Likewise, if no one else is using a toilet, you get pollution in the waterways, you get pollution in the soil, and you get health problems. So with sanitation, even though I buy a toilet, I'm not assured that I'm actually buying health. Whereas when it comes to energy, I know what I'm paying for. I pay for the energy that I consume. And this is why we actually find that the willingness to pay for sanitation is always very much less by households than the willingness to pay for water connections. So we have a problem. Sanitation is a public good. There's not much by way of public money. What do? What are our options? I'm going to suggest that there's 4 options on the table for us that we can actually do. The first thing we should try to do is to target an improvement in efficiency. And I'll describe why that's so important, particularly in the sanitation sector. The next thing that we should do is spend our money more effectively. So we don't just need to spend more, but we need to spend better. Then we need to be really creative and create markets. Sanitation, as I said, is a public good. A market isn't going to emerge organically. It's going to take government policy, government nudging, government intervention to actually create these markets. And finally, certainly in the urban space, and when we're talking about fecal sludge management, where the investments are large and lumpy, there are opportunities to crowd in private finance, and I'll give you some examples. Let's now move firstly to the efficiency argument. And here, of course, most of our data actually comes, I'm sorry, I'll see if that slide will come on. No? Okay, somehow one slide has vanished. Never mind. Let's go on. Let me just say there's ample scope to actually increase efficiency. But let's go to this slide about spending wisely or spending better before we spend more. And to give you an example of that, here's a really, really interesting trial that you might find quite stimulating and surprising from Bangladesh. I could have picked very many, but this is just one that received quite a lot of publicity. So this was a trial about what kind of sanitation interventions would work best in rural Bangladesh. The first thing that they tried was a behavior change intervention. And what they found that this had very little statistical impact. Then the next thing that they tried was to support vendors. These are suppliers of sanitation products, masons, etc. Again, they found this had very little effect. Then they gave a subsidy to all households. This had a small effect, but a statistically significant one. Add the subsidy to behavior change. As we've seen with SBM and everywhere else, this had a very much larger effect. But the largest effect, the largest bang for the buck that they actually got, was by targeting subsidies to the poorest people in the village. And this is because you got what was called a social multiplier. The thinking of the richer people was, if the poorest person in my village is using a toilet and has a toilet, then I have to buy a toilet and actually use it. So targeting the very, very poorest in Bangladesh generated a social multiplier. So here's an example of spending wisely, spending very wisely, because all we have to do is to spend on the poor, and then we know a social multiplier will build on that. Will this work everywhere? Let's just take one other example. So we take an example from a trial in Cambodia. Here they found that when they subsidized the poor, sure enough, the poor increased their latrine use, but there was no spillover effect, there was no social multiplier onto richer households. So of course what this tells us, behavior change is a very, very complex business. There is no one size that actually fits all. What we have to do to spend wisely is to understand very deeply the social context before we unleash our policies. And of course that's very, very hard in large countries to understand to that level of granularity the social context. But the basic point is that by spending better, we generate large savings, particularly at a time when there's not much money left on the credit card to actually spend because public funds are tight and there's many other people clamoring for these public funds. Let's turn now to the creation of sanitation markets. At the outset, remember these markets are not going to evolve by magic. They won't evolve organically. They won't evolve by magic organically because sanitation is a public good. So you have to, as government policymakers and administrators, work to creating the demand and to creating the supply. So let's see what's been done and what's worked. If you think that the major constraint to demand is poverty or credit, you have at your disposal tools that I will talk about a little bit more, such as microfinance or a subsidy. Many of you who have been in the sanitation business for a long time will know there's a resistance to subsidies. Perhaps that's somewhat misplaced. There ought to be a resistance to subsidies that distort rather than subsidies per se, because poor people cannot necessarily afford toilets. If you believe the constraint, as it often is behavior change, that's obviously what you also have to target to raise demand. And finally, just because you raise demand, don't believe that markets will actually emerge. You also have to provide support to the vendors, and sometimes you have to be clever and create markets, as in markets for fertilizer and fuel for the waste that's actually generated as a consequence of that. So all up to create the market will take policy and government intervention all the way through. Let me now say a few words about microfinance, because I think for all of the ministers that are over here, all of your countries have some sort of microfinance in operation. We've been using a lot of microfinance in sanitation. Let me tell you about some of the experience, including from India. And the experience broadly has been one of, I would say, an overarching success story. The typical loan globally for sanitation for microfinance, as far as we can tell, is relatively small. It's $50. But if you earn $1 or $2 a day, $50 is a lot of money. It's almost a month's salary or more. What you find with most microfinance loans for sanitation across the world is repayment rates of 90%, and in India going up to 98%. If any bank could get repayments of 98%, they would be absolutely delighted. In other words, these things are working, people want them, and they pay back the loans that they get. What it turns out that people like the most is the flexible conditions that microfinance offers. So for instance, a lot of poor people would rather pay you $1 back every week rather than paying you $4 or $5 at the end of the month. And with microfinance, you can actually give them that flexibility. But of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's obviously a downside to everything. And at least from what I can tell, the biggest downside to microfinance loans the world over is the very, very high interest rates. You often see interest rates well in excess of 20% in many, many parts of the world. Think of it another way, that with this microfinance we are providing sanitation, and sanitation is like infrastructure, it is a public good. If we had to pay 20% interest for the roads that we built, we would not be building very many roads. So we need to think, I think, a little bit harder about the interest rates that we require people to pay for the microfinance loans. And finally, we all know, because so much detail and so much work goes into these microfinance loans, they're very, very hard to scale. Let me change gear now and talk about crowding in private finance. And this is very much more relevant when we are talking about large investments for something like fecal sludge management or utilities that provide sewage services. We know there's very low levels of investment in the sanitation sector, and you know that if you want to bring in private money, it's actually very, very simple. There's only two things that you have to do. You either reduce risk or you increase the return. And now, because I'm running out of time, I'm simply going to give you one example of each of how we can reduce risk in the sanitation sector and how we can increase returns, and suggest to you we need to work an awful lot harder on these sorts of innovation instruments. So, reducing risk. It turns out you can go into the market today and insure yourself against a large number of risks. Foreign investors don't like to come into markets and countries they don't know. Today, you can insure yourself against a risk of a breach of contract, expropriation of assets, restrictions on your transfer of funds from the country where you operate to your home country, war, and civil disturbance. This has been seldom used in the sanitation sector. One good example was in Jordan, where it was used. It managed to crowd in over $30 million worth of finance of 3 very, very big equity investors to build a wastewater treatment plant. There's a few other examples of it, but not as many as we see in water, certainly not as many as we see in roads and in other sectors. But there's absolutely no reason, once you've defined what the rate of return is, why these guarantees cannot be used. What about increasing the returns? One way to increase the returns is to reduce the borrowing cost. And we know that if you were to go to the private sector to borrow, the interest rate is usually quite high. So here is a totally hypothetical example. Suppose that you were trying to bring in someone to manage your fecal sludge and invest in your country. You might want to get a domestic loan, say of $10 million, and say the private rate might be, interest rate might be 15%. And usually the length of a private loan is quite short. It's about 8 to 10 years. 10 years would be quite long in many circumstances. But if you blended that loan with concessional finance that came from the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, World Bank, wherever, A, you could raise a lot more money. You could borrow $30, $40 million. B, the interest rate would be orders of magnitude lower. It wouldn't be 10%, it would be 2 or 3%. And C, the length of time that you have to repay that loan is also a lot longer, 20 years plus very often. In other words, what this does is it radically reduces the cost of borrowing, and it could bring in an investor who would otherwise be reluctant to come in. So let me now conclude with 4 takeaway messages. We first made this discovery, humanity first made this discovery in the 19th century, that we need clean sanitation to develop and for our children to stay healthy and to become healthy adults. We have a chance now, in the 21st century, to make this a reality. We also have to recognize the reality that public funds are scarce, and we have to be innovative and we have to look elsewhere. So what can we do? The first thing that you should do is to take to your Minister of Finance a very, very strong economic case that investment in sanitation pays, and it pays very, very well. I showed you one example of the rate of return. Mr. Amitabh Kant gave you another example of 6% GDP in India. The minister from Niger spoke about Niger, $150 million a year. The examples abound all the way through. If you want to convince your finance minister, you also want to tell your finance minister that you're very efficient. You're spending your money efficiently. So target efficiency. Also spend your money wisely. Before we spend more, we should learn how to spend better. And as I tried to emphasize in our sector, it can be quite hard to learn how to spend better because you're talking about human behavior. And human behavior is very, very complex and very difficult to actually predict. But doing the homework, doing the research will pay, and will pay handsomely. And then I would suggest to you, you've seen quite a few examples across the world, but we do have wide opportunities, A, to create markets, and for the lumpy investment, there are instruments to crowd in more of the private finance and private resources. With that, let me end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Damania, for that really excellent presentation. It brings out all the issues, all the challenges of financing for sanitation. I would now like to open this floor for questions. Anyone can shoot the question. Just make it a direct question, and you can ask any one of us. Please. Please, the gentleman there. Can someone pass the mic?
Thank you very much. My name is Tim Wainwright. I'm the Chief Executive of WaterAid UK, and I wanted to thank India for hosting this fantastic conference. It's been great. I had a quick comment and question for Minister Suleiman. I wanted to say how much I was delighted to see you giving us a privileged preview of the announcement that you're expecting to be made in November. And I wanted to say that I think, certainly I speak for my organization and no doubt a number of others in this room, that we stand ready to assist Nigeria in tackling what must be one of the biggest challenges remaining in the world in sanitation. And my question was simply, not necessarily for my own organization, but just to ask you, what support could the international community provide to Nigeria to enable you to meet this tremendous challenge you're setting yourselves? Thank you.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Moi, je suis Sourou Adinda du Bénin et je remercie les panélistes.
I'm not able to hear the floor. It's not clear. There is a lot of echo, so I'm not able to hear.
Pour un mécanisme de financement, parce que toutes les présentations montrent que la pauvreté rime avec le manque d'assainissement. Une première étape.
Rhymes is synonymous with lack of sanitation. I think that once this step has been taken, we can talk about subsidies. We can also send them to these localities, projects which will increase production capacities so that there will be efficient revenue generation, so that they can also invest in sanitation. Because in our countries we have projects which will enhance the productivity of people. Food processing projects, they should be oriented towards localities which are aware of the positive outcomes of improvement in sanitation.
My name is Kamal Kar from CLTS Foundation. My question to Honorable Minister from Nigeria. And I thought that you would mention that the two states, Cross River State and Benue State, which are entirely different from any other states of your country, and how these two states made a huge difference, and the political will and empowerment of the local people, and looking into Jamphara, Jigawa, and many other states, the horrible status of sanitation, and if you compare with Cross River and Benue State and a few other states. You see, the money, the investment in Nigeria, as you said, it will take a long time, and nobody knows that how many years it's going to take. But the amount of money the community has mobilized, and the governors and the LGAs, they have empowered the communities in these two states. And if Nigeria could bring the governors from other states and interaction with Cross River State and Benue states and few other states, those who are doing there, I think inside in the country, in your own country, the examples are there, and it could be, but they have created it over the last 4 or 5 years already. But looking into this, each country's own homegrown examples and spreading it, is the story also, Niger. There are people, the ministers from Niger, I met them. Can I request the people from Niger to kindly raise your hands? Niger? Are there anyone? No. Okay. So in Niger, it's one of the worst in terms of access to sanitation. But the political will, and I think Mr. Richard has mentioned the investment in Niger, and I just arrived today. The Niger minister and the delegation, they saw me, and they all shouted together, Abatutu Aheria Niger. I mean, it's a local language, but this we created, that means stop open defecation in Niger. And the political will and empowering the local people, involving all the local leaders, enormous, fantastic. Instead of waiting for big fund, this and that, and the story of Bangladesh, that's where I worked.
I'd like to request others to ask questions as well.
Yes.
So can we move on?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah. Is it addressed to Mr. Suleiman so that he can respond to? Yeah, please.
My goes to Mr. Richard. It has to do with financing of sanitation. And in most cases, when the banks are actually giving facilities for sanitation, it comes with a lot of strings. And the strings are, we need to make impact assessment, we need to organize workshop, we need to do this and that. Before you finish, what is actually meant for the actual implementation of the project is just something minute. In effect, nothing is done. In most countries, the experts are there. Sanitation has to be the infrastructure. So we want to just make an appeal. Mine is not just a question. That since we have the men on the ground, the money should come, so it will go direct into the project implementation.
Thank you. I'd request Mr. Suleiman to kindly respond, and then I'll request Mr. Richard to respond to the last question.
Thank you very much. The question from the representative of UK, WaterAid UK. Mercifully, we are having a lot of support currently, I know, even including WaterAid. But if we have to make this quantum leap, I said the critical thing is budget. And obviously, we are going to need a lot of additional funding injected into this business. But let me say there are some critical things that we need. One of them being we need to look at our institutional arrangement again. And I've already mentioned in my statement that we have open discussions with India on this to learn from their experiences. But one of the key things I've noticed also that is lacking for us, and this also cuts across into water supply, is the issue of technology, getting the appropriate technology. So development partners that are all over the world and operating in different circumstances, one of the things I always advocate is for them to share knowledge about specifically about the kind of technologies. We don't expect the same technology to work everywhere, but there might be compatibilities. And they have a better, the international agencies have a better appreciation of what technologies are there out there. But technologies that are cheap and affordable and also functional, because we also have challenges of water. We cannot be talking about flushing systems in rural communities. So we'll welcome suggestions and some kind of introduction of new technologies that are affordable to people. That will also, we believe, is a factor that can help accelerate the process of attaining the open defecation-free status. Again, the progress we are making has to be sustained. We have said that we have like 6 local governments and thousands of communities that are ODF, but are we really going back to check from time to time on the progress being made there, whether the status is permanent, is solid, or whether there are lapses here and there. While, because we have a huge country, we're making efforts trying to get other communities to be ODF, we stand also